Welcome back. This is Module 2. What we're going to talk about in this screencast is research methods. This is just a very, very brief introduction to this topic, but I think this often catches students in a psychology class off guard because when you come to a psychology class, I think you're going to, students think that they're going to be talking about Dr. Phil and stuff like that, and here we end up talking about the laboratory research methods, things like that. So stick with this. It's pretty easy to understand. There's a few concepts that are very important. Those are going to be highlighted in red, but I want you to understand this. And this is what makes psychology a science. I mean, we can have our own opinions and ideas all the time, but if there's not any validity behind those opinions, it's kind of worthless. So what can we do to make sure that what we say is the best truth that we know, and what we can do is research. So here, again, if you remember from the first lecture, that's Wilhelm Wundt there in the middle in his psychological laboratory in Leipzig, Germany. So he's really the founder of physiological psychology. So when we talk about research methods, we start with this step. Now I know this graphic isn't very good, but it's out of your book, so I wanted to stick with that. So this example here, people who are succeeding at sports report that the ball looks bigger to them. That was the question, like in baseball. So maybe baseball players that think the ball that looks bigger to them, maybe they're better baseball players. So that's your initial observation or question. And I could just say that, like, oh, baseball players that are really good, the ball looks bigger to them. But if I say that, how do you know that that's true? I mean, how do you know I'm not out of my ever-loving mind? Well, what you can do is develop a hypothesis, and a hypothesis is testable. So maybe players who perceive the ball to be bigger will experience better batting performance. So we could perceive ball size. We could ask them how big a ball looks. We could develop all sorts of different ways to measure ball size perception. And we could look at batting performance. The next thing we would do is we would design a study. So we could take players from softball leagues. We could show them a display with 8 black circles and ask them to show the circle that they think best represents the size of a softball. And then we could also get data from the season, and we could compute batting averages. Then we would analyze the data and draw conclusions. So we would statistically look at the data, and hopefully it would reveal that players with higher batting averages tended to choose larger circles as the correct size for a softball. So we would have a correlation between those things. We couldn't say that one causes the other, but we know that they're related. And we have the empirical or research data to support that. Then we could report the findings, maybe in a journal. That's what we talk about with like publication. And the journals for psychology are called peer-reviewed journals. So a group of your peers would look at your research and tell you if it was basically good enough to publish or not. And then in the end, you might have more questions. You could discuss in the article the weaknesses of your study, or you could talk about future directions that you could go in the study. And then you can kind of redo the circle again. If you have more questions, you could design other studies, better studies, figure it out. You could make a whole career out of determining factors, psychological factors that improve batting percentages. So we talked in the first class about free will versus determinism. And in determinism, what we're really talking about is that all events, whether they're physical, behavior, or mental, are determined by specific causal factors, and that we can figure out what those factors are. They're knowable. And again, the level of analysis that you choose is up to you. So whether you're looking at genetics or social factors, that's what the researcher does. So the steps of research, the first step is the initial phase in which you make those observations, you have beliefs or information or general knowledge that lead to a new idea or a different way about thinking about some sort of phenomenon. What you would develop is a theory, and that's an organized set of concepts that explains a phenomenon or set of phenomenon. And psychologists use theories then to formulate research questions. So step 2 would be to develop a hypothesis or hypotheses. These are tentative and testable explanations of the relationship between two or more events. That's the important part there, that it's testable, that it's something that you can put into a research design and carry out an experiment. And that design, we're going to use the scientific method. So again, the scientific method is a set of procedures that's used for gathering and interpreting objective information in a way that minimizes error and yields dependable generalizations. What we're trying to do is minimize bias and end up with conclusions that have maximum objectivity. Conclusions are objective when they're not influenced by emotions or personal biases. So we use a scientific method to set up our studies. But we have a problem in that there's something that's called observer bias, and that can challenge objectivity. Observer bias is a distortion of evidence because of personal motives or expectations of the viewer. And if you're a researcher and you're doing research, potentially you're being paid by a company to do research, you have motives to end up with certain results. Maybe it's your dissertation, your PhD dissertation, and you really want to find specific results. Well, you might not look at the research as clearly as someone that is not vested in that. So how do we remedy observer bias? Well, the first thing that we do is standardization. And this is developing a uniform set of procedures for treating each participant the same in the research study. So whoever comes in the door for the research study is run through the research study the exact same way. And then we have operational definitions. And these are defined in terms of the specific operation or procedure used to determine its presence. All variables in a research study must be given operational definitions. Now that sounds a little confusing, but let's say we're looking at like little kids' behavior in a classroom, and you want to determine, like if they're being off task. Well, what is off task? How do you define off task? Well, maybe one thing that would be indicative of off task behavior is getting out of their seat. So you could define getting out of the seat at an inappropriate time as something that you would look at to answer your question, or squirming or fidgeting or talking out loud when they're not supposed to. And they're things that you can define. So if you're measuring the behavior or the person sitting next to you is measuring the behavior, you're looking at it in the same way. It's defined for you. Now, when you develop a research study, you have variables, research variables. And these are the factors in a study that change in amount and kind. There's two different variables. There's going to be the independent variable and the dependent variable. This is a little confusing, but you'll get this. So sometimes we abbreviate these as IV and DV. The independent variable is the thing that you as a researcher are going to manipulate. The dependent variable is the thing that you are going to measure at the end. So you have the independent variable, and your research results are the dependent variables. So you can think of the dependent variable as being dependent on what you do to the independent variable.